Welcome to Down the Garden Path. I'm your host, Joanne Shaw, landscape designer and plant lover. I enjoy discussing down to earth tips and advice to help you seasonally manage your garden and landscape. And I also aim to bring you interesting and relevant topics to educate you all about the landscaping and horticultural industry. Welcome to Down the Garden Path, and thank you for joining me here again. Designing with native plants continues to be a hot topic and a very hot trend. I would love for you to listen to this encore episode that Matthew and I did all about designing with native plants. And stay tuned for another episode, a new one from just me on native plants coming soon. If you have questions about native plants or a particular plant, please email me. And thanks again for listening to Down the Garden Path.
And now, right to your hosts of Down the Garden Path, Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing.
Hello, and welcome to Down the Garden Path, where each week we discuss down-to-earth tips and advice while doing our best to help you seasonally manage your garden and landscape. I'm Joanne Shaw, owner of Down2Earth Landscape Design, and with me is my co-host and co-author, Matthew Dressing.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Matthew Dressing, owner of Natural Affinity Garden Design. As landscape designers and gardeners, we believe it's important and possible to have great gardens, which are sustainable and low maintenance, and we want to help you make it happen.
That's right. And so when people think about native plants, most often they think about a wild meadow or an unkept urban lot. But natives offer many design opportunities and benefits to our gardens and landscapes. On this episode of Down the Garden Path, we discuss how to design with native plants and strike a balance in your garden between natives and the foreign ornamentals we love so much. Have you replaced your lawn with alternatives? And what plants did you use? Whoops, that was last week's notes, but that's okay. So native plants, Matt.
That's right.
And it's true. And I have been guilty of that, thinking, some of the, when people that it's weedy looking and it's, because a lot of our weeds are technically native plants, right? Like native plant or like weeds are always in the eye of the beholder. But yeah, I'm excited that we can talk about some native plants today, which are kind of all the rage in the gardening circles, but actually how to design with them.
That's right. Yeah, I think a lot of us overlook our native plants in favor of all those ornamentals. And again, we often think about them, they're those weeds or they're that thing in that lawn, or you're driving and you see that beautiful open meadow, but it's just so unorganized and flowering and grassy or weedy looking, that we think that there can't be any value or benefit to that sort of thing, or maybe even those plants in there. But a lot of them are very beneficial and support our ecosystem. And I think that's where we're going back to, right, with climate change and our loss of our insects and a decline of certain species. We're realizing that these plants are really foundation plants to support or large key components of these larger ecosystems that we've completely removed. And now we're wondering, why is this happening? Or where are these things going? Or I always think of, driving up to the cottage when we were younger and you had all those insects hitting your, where did they go? And I mean, we've been spraying and removing their habitats and things like that. But again, just one of those key components that kind of affect a little bit of everybody. So we've often talked about it, benefits of native plants, and they're great for our gardens, and there's always a place for them. But how do we get there, and how do we use it? How do we look at something that we've always thought of as so bizarre and wild, and then actually create or use them in our space? And I think we kind of always think that it's going to look as neat and tidy as all the ornamental plants that we see at garden centers, have perfectly round or nice round mounding Roseanne geranium or hydrangea, but they have a little bit of a different shape to them. So how do we use those?
They do. And the other thing is that we've often talked about before too, that most design clients or most people want a quote unquote low maintenance garden. And that's another benefit of native plants is they tend to be a little more drought tolerant, a little bit more heat tolerant. And or if you've got a wet spot, if you again, it's the right plant in the right spot. But if you have the right plant in the right spot and the right native plant, especially, then plant it and forget about it, really. Yeah. So, so if you've got questions, so listeners tonight, if you have questions for us about native plants or how to design with native plants or how to add some native plants into your current designs, we'd love to chat about it. You can email us here at Down the Garden Path Podcast at hotmail.com.
That's right. And speaking of some questions that are popping in pretty quick, Charlie's written in, hello to Joanne and Matt. Do native plants need more care than non-native plants?
Ooh, good question, Charlie.
Good question. So I think what we need to do, or one of the things we'll do today, is define what native plants are. But very quickly, Charlie, yeah, depending on which one you have, in general, native plants don't need as much attention because they have adapted and they've evolved right where we're living. So they know the weather, they know those ups and downs in the cold. They know that if you're in a more arid region or you don't get as much rain, they have evolved with that longer than we've been here. So they already know, they've adapted, they've evolved to deal with that. And they usually have survival strategies in place, whether it's silvery foliage or deeper tap roots or, dormant periods, things like that. So knowing our native plants, and we're going to get to some examples as well, will definitely lower our maintenance and need overall less care than most of our ornamentals. Because remember, our ornamentals are coming from other regions in the world where their soils are different, their lighting might be different, they may or may not be adapted to the heat or the drought and things like that. So I think going back to what is our definition of a native plant, and we had Kathy Jentz on not last week, but 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about her ground cover revolution, her new book, Ground Cover Revolution, and we talked about or touched on native plants. And Kathy brought up a great point: is how do we define native? So how have you always defined native? Asking you.
Oh, you're asking me. Oh my goodness. Well, I think, because of what I do, I think I, research really and plants that are labeled native or, the different courses I've taken. And I know some of our show notes are tonight about one of the courses I've taken as well. So I think it's just, but how I define it is, I don't know. That's a tough one. Actually, you caught me off guard. I should know this, but I think in schooling and in our research, plants that grew here naturally, that some of them have been improved on, let's say, and so then we'll also talk a little bit later about nativars, right? That's a nativar.
That's right? A nativar, and that was our show last week as well. A little bit of our background information on nativars. But much like you, I defined it as it was just a plant that's always grown here, right? I mean, it's from here. Yeah. So, but there is a few different ways to look at, the definition of a native. And we look at that way with my students as well. But Kathy kind of put it in a nice little way too. Where is it native from specifically? So really looking at it, it's always grown here, but did it grow right here? If I stood where I am now and went back 400 years in time, am I going to find, this plant? So is it right here? Or is it from your ecoregion? Is it from the Great Plains? The plains, span a large amount of area where we're here in the Carolinian forest. It covers a large amount of area. These defined ecoregions where certain habitats, certain weather patterns and habitat patterns exist, do they live within that native ecoregion? So, may not be as defined as right here, but, maybe it's not even defined as just Ontario or, just one of the northern United States, but maybe it spans a larger part of Ontario or jumps over the lakes into, New York State and a little further south, right? So that ecoregion it doesn't have borders per se by country.
Right.
right? And then you pull out it even further, or are you looking for something exactly to Ontario? Is it native to Arizona specifically? And that is a little bit of a broader region. Or again, when we look at our students, or when I talk about my students, they're very interested in, is it North American native? So was it
Yeah.
here on the continent, but we've moved it around, whether it was things like First Nations moving things like corn up into certain areas as agriculture developed, or are we moving things just slightly out of their native ranges as well? So
Mm-hmm.
there's a wide range of how you can define native, where it was from, but what is the where? So who
Right.
or where is the where?
And so for our listeners, because the nice thing about our listeners is that you guys are all over the place, right? All over North America and Canada. So you can search your ecoregions of North America. So you can look that up. I've just pulled up the website here. North America has been divided into 15 broad level 1 ecological regions. So once you kind of get an idea of your region, then that can help you figure out which plants would grow best. And I think sometimes, although if you don't want to do all that research, then really it's going to your local garden center, somebody that's fairly close to you, and looking at the native plants that they stock. And you can talk to them there. But if you do want to know a little bit more and do a little bit of a deeper dive, and some things like I think of rutabaga or black-eyed Susan that everybody knows, it may have a really large ecological region and be native in a lot of different areas. It isn't, but then there's might be some other smaller ones, plants that are more concentrated in different ecological areas, right? So it really varies.
It does, and you bring up a great point too. Even within that ecoregion, that plant might be native there, but even the plant itself has its own native range, right? So yeah, like you were saying, it might be very concentrated in the ecoregion, or it might actually join or cross into other adjacent ecoregions or zones or areas as well. Yeah. So you've decided you want to go with some native plants. Where do you go for them? So I think you had just kind of touched on that already. Definitely your local independent garden centers. That's a great place to start because they can order specific plants for you. So you can go into your perennial department, if that's what you call it, and you can speak to the supervisor or the staff there and see what they can do about searching for a specific native plant for you. And again, depending on where you are, whether you're in Florida or Alaska, or
Right.
on the East Coast in Newfoundland, you'll always have hopefully a source, or that'll be in one of those mixes of
Right.
your plants.
Yeah. I think right
We're
now too, it's because it's such a hot topic.
Yeah.
It's probably small and it's probably like in the back corner of the garden center, but there is a native plant area. And one of the biggest challenges I think for garden centers is they don't really look great, like in a pot, right? Like they're not the colorful, they're not going to be flowering and pretty. I mean, except for like the 10 minutes that trilliums bloom for,
Yes.
for instance, in the pot. I can remember when I worked at the garden center, right? Like they're just sad looking little plants in a pot. And yeah, so
Yeah.
they're not going to be something that's showy, and it's not going to be by the cash register, and it's not going to be an impulse purchase. You've got to go looking for it. But I think because of the demand, they are there is an area probably in most garden centers, and I'm assuming they're in separate sections, but sometimes they may be mixed with other perennials, right? And do the typical alphabetical order by common name or alphabetical order by botanical name, but they're never going to be like the showy thing that you can't just resist. They're going to you're buying them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Right.
mean, they may, once they're established in your garden, they may be beautiful, but they tend to not be the showiest. There's probably a couple of exceptions, right? Like, because is Columbine native? Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
So when it's blooming in the garden centers, it's pretty showy. But yeah, so there's a few exceptions, I'm sure.
Definitely. And you're right. You're never going to find them on an end cap, and they're never going to replace, they're never going to bump the end cap of hydrangeas to do a native plant display.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
You also
So
may find, I was going to say,
ahead.
we also may find, like, we're very fortunate. We have a couple of native plant specific growers
Mhm.
and garden centers in our
Mhm.
area. So also take a look around your province or state or your city, wherever you are, to see if you have a native nursery who's growing specific natives to your region. And even their selection, they both may be, say, for example, native to Ontario, but you may find two different lines of perennials or native
Mhm.
plants. And remember, as we say native plants, we often think of, like we were saying earlier, that little pot of echinacea, rudbeckia, or aquilegia, or columbines, right? Or our little pot. But we may have also, native shrubs, native vines, native trees. There are a lot
Right.
of other native, forms that you might find out there as well, especially with your trees, right? Well, you go out to your, find your red oak or your red maple out in the tree section, you're always going to find just the straight native. So you may also find beyond independent garden centers and native plant specific nurseries to help you
Mhm.
out. And you can call them up, and they often have lots of resources on their website to talk about the benefits of your local native plants and what their selection has, and a phone number to
Yeah.
call.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Wild Seed Project. We had Anna on last year, right?
That's
And she
right.
talked about native plants, and she's the ecological program manager at Wild Seed Project in Portland, Maine. So she talked about they have a lot of programs. I know I still get the emails. So they do a lot of plantings, they do a lot of seed. So that's definitely something, if you're in the East Coast in the US, that's something to take a look at. And I'm sure there's a similar community, similar native plant society or something like that. We have the David Suzuki Foundation as well, kind of promoting native plants and planting and seeds, that type of thing. So yeah. So it's definitely, I think people are becoming more and more aware. Now we are definitely not saying you no longer can plant hydrangeas and Roseanne geranium and catmint and things like that. So at least that's how I think I feel. I think Matt, you agree as well. I mean, there are some hardcore, you should only plant native people in the community, and that's fine if that's what they want to do. Um, and it depends on how much space you have. I think that's harder the more space you have, right?
Yes.
So yeah, so it definitely is a personal choice. And there's lots when it comes to gardening, that's the thing. That's the joy about gardening is that you can have a personal choice. You can have an all white garden. You can have no evergreen. Like I was always fighting with clients who want no evergreens in their garden. Or an all purple and white garden. Like it's really about personal choice. So if you want to have only native plants in your gardens, that's fine too. And I think the other purpose for native plants is if you've got really challenging growing conditions, then
Mm.
sometimes that's hard with your regular hybridized plants, wet soils, clay soils, something that's really unique. If you're having a hard time growing something, I think of dry shade
Yeah.
under evergreens, right? Where many of the typical things that we would suggest, and people, love their hostas and stuff, but even they struggle under in those conditions. But some of the native things like wild ginger and May apple, like they thrive.
That's right.
So yeah, so I kind of rambled there, but
That is all right. So yeah, I agree with you completely. You don't have to completely rip up your garden, and that's not what we're saying. Or change your design, natives only. There
yeah.
are a place for both of them, and I think what we want to do is emphasize that you can design with both of them. There is a balance that you can be had. That they will both bring benefits. Native plants do bring other benefits to the weather, to the local biology, and I think there is a place for both of them in your garden. So we'll get into some tips and tricks on what we can do to design and incorporate our native plants in there without making it look like that crazy wild meadow space, right? So,
Mhm, mhm. We have a question from Lenny. So he's asking about what are some examples of native plants here in Toronto? Thank you.
ooh, what are some beautiful natives? Yeah, again, depending on your situation and what your conditions are, there's lots of different plants. But I mean, we have native junipers. I mean, starting with some of the trees, we've got our native red maples. We've got native oaks. Lots of different trees and shrubs, hop hornbeams, things like that. You could grow lots of different shrubs, our nine barks,
Serviceberry, yeah, nine barks and
service berries.
serviceberry.
That's right. Pines. There is even native junipers to our area. The regular Juniperus horizontalis, our spreading juniper is native to here. So there's a lots of wide variety of trees, shrubs, and perennials. What we don't see is a lot of annuals,
Right.
actually,
Yeah.
in our area. Yeah.
But think of Lenny, if you think of like trilliums, something that's
Trilliums.
and like I mentioned, so shade wise, I think of trilliums, wild ginger, like I said, May apple. So it's a lot of things, ferns, several ferns, right?
Mhm.
When you think about going to the cottage or going into the country and seeing some of the things that are just growing, even Annabelle hydrangea, the botanical name is, oof,
Yes. Hydrangea
right?
arborescens.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hydrangea arborescens, surprisingly is native. So yeah, so there are many things, and then you get specific things like butterfly weed. Um,
Yeah, there are different asters, there are different butterfly weeds, there's coneflowers, bee balms, rudbeckias, lots of different wild perennial herbaceous and
Milkweed. I'm
shrubs.
thinking like, what's
Oh,
the
you're
one
thinking
for the
going milkweed?
monarchs?
Okay.
I'm trying to think of. I'm like sitting here going, okay, butterfly weed, but there's also milkweed, and there's a lot of different varieties of milkweed for sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. There's lots of different ones. And
Hmm.
again, they may be fully, native specifically to Toronto or our area, but again, they may also have wider ranges
Right.
as well. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, so Lenny, it's just about Googling, looking for them, depending on whether you have sun, shade, wet, dry, and so it's not just about native plants. I think you gotta narrow it down a little bit.
Right, right. What exactly are you looking for? Like, are you looking for
Hmm.
trees, shrubs, and how are we going
Hmm.
to interact with all of those?
That's right.
Yeah.
And Evan is asking if native plants are better for wildlife, and they often are, aren't they?
Yeah, they often are. They've often, especially native wildlife that's naturally here, right? They often provide a housing or an overwintering site for
Hmm.
our, especially for our insects, including that in the broad umbrella that is wildlife, but our insects as well as some of our animals. Remember our Juniperus horizontalis that's native to Ontario and northern Canada. It is so low growing. It is an overwintering site for small mammals. They will burrow under and use it kind of as a shelter. The stems of our plants, right? The certain species, like again, going into our monarch, which is probably the universal classic example, right? Mom
Hmm.
looks for the specific species of the oh my gosh, the milkweed to lay her eggs on and so her caterpillars can feed on. So they're often a habitat source. Again, they're often a specific food source. So insects, again, they're noticing specific nectar and pollen resources, laying their eggs, even animals, mast trees that are producing specific fruit and nuts that these birds and other small mammals are looking for and eating to sustain themselves. And as we remove those trees where they become less and less, those animals have to leave. And their ranges start to change as well, and we see less and less of them. So
Hmm.
yeah, we go ahead.
No, I was thinking of moths too. Like I
Oh
think that's
yes,
something, right? So I think you think about it as a food chain. So if there's many things that a moth like, and it's amazing when you start to research it, how many um what is it called? Like when an insect only, I want to say soloist, that's not the word.
the larval species.
No, yeah, something that eats like, well, like for instance, the monarch will only eat the like the caterpillars can only eat.
Oh, like a specialist.
Right, a specialist. So there's many like moths and that need a specific plant in order to survive. And then there's birds that usually eat those moths. Like there is a food chain, right?
Yes, exactly. We have that specialization of that moth to that plant or that insect to that plant that, right, those two or three species will
Yeah,
eat them and they're so right. And then it goes up that food chain.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So if something happens in that chain, then that's really, that really kind of messes things up. I done a presentation and I researched. So if anybody has an oak tree or is near anybody that has an oak tree, the acorn. So there is a um, the weevil. So it's a weevil. So when the acorns fall on the ground, if you've ever picked one up and it has a little hole in it, right?
Yes.
So there's a weevil, and it takes 2 years for it to come out. So it goes, the little egg goes inside it lays its egg inside the acorn, and then they eat the inside of it on the ground, and they come out. So it needs, it needs an oak tree. That insect needs an oak tree. And then once they've come out, then they hollowed out. There's certainly birds that go and eat that weevil. And then there's a particular ant that needs that, also goes in. So once the weevil has left that acorn, and a particular I'm going to say species of ant goes in and lives and lays its eggs inside that same acorn. So, that's an example of, the circle of life, and so with there's a scarcity of oak trees, or if, and this goes also back to the whole cleaning up your gardens. It's a little bit of a segue. Sorry, everybody. But if we all, like, if every single acorn in the forest was cleaned up, then what happens to the weevil? Right. And then what happens to that ant, and what happens to the birds and the other insects that feed off of those two things? So definitely, that's a long answer, Evan, to your yes. The native plants are better for wildlife.
Yes, they are definitely. And I think you go into Ron's question too. Ron asked, "Hi, Joanne and Matt. Can you give us some information or facts about native trees? Why do we always hear about native plants? Thank you so much." So, like you had
Wasn't
said,
that
right?
last week's show, Matt? We had a replay, but I thought we did native trees, didn't we?
We had, well, yeah, we had nativars.
Okay.
So it wasn't specific on native trees.
Okay. Sorry. No, it's okay, Ron. But yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of, the oak tree. So yeah, there are a lot of, you're right. We should be talking more about native trees.
That's right. And like you were saying, like the white oak, right? There are over, I think you said,
Red
or
oak.
you told me once upon a, what one?
Red oak.
Was it the red oak? Okay. Well, the white oak, we know that it holds, like, there's over 500, it's a host of over 500 different caterpillars, insects, birds, and again, connecting all of that chain. So, yeah, so just even choosing one specific tree. And that goes for every different tree will have different things, whether, it's a hemlock or sugar maple, a red maple, a bur oak, a serviceberry. We have our pagoda dogwood is native to our area as well. So those beautiful flowers. I saw some actually just this weekend, our tulip trees. So there's lots of larger trees that we see out there, different birches, different evergreens that will, again, house lots of different species. So, I mean, Ron, we could do a whole show on just, the three native trees and then all the host animals and insects that we use it. But you are right. We definitely hear more and more about native plants. And I think we all think of herbaceous perennials or those, wild meadow-like plants. But again, there are lots of host trees like our white oak, our red oak, our maples, our tamaracks, our
hickory. I mean, we did do a show. I can't find the date on it, Matt, but we did do a show. We'll put it in our show notes, but we did do a show in the past on native trees. We did a native month, I think, in August, maybe last year. So yeah, because we have our list here of Matt's top favorite deciduous trees and Joanne's top favorite deciduous trees, and then evergreens as well. So yeah, so that was a great episode, and that would be a deeper dive, Ron, if you want to check out that podcast. And like I said, we'll put it in our show notes. Red bud. I mean, it's funny because a lot of the native plants are what's blooming now, right? Serviceberry, red buds. Flowering dogwoods haven't started blooming quite yet. Pagoda dogwoods, like you said. So there's definitely quite a few flower, and those are the trees. And then evergreens, things like white pine. We all know, if you think of, everybody thinks of the group of seven art, right? Those are all native trees, right? That pine tree, those windswept pine trees, but also jack pines and
eastern red cedar, which is that Juniperus virginiana. It's that one
Mm-hmm.
that juniper looking thing that we are driving around now, especially again in the GTA. We know that everybody lives a little bit of different places, but here in the GTA, we see them as really brown looking dead cedars, but that's just their winter color. And then they
Right.
come up as that beautiful green juniper. Yeah.
Yeah, and hemlock. So if you go through a hike, if you did a hike this weekend, it was a long weekend here in Canada, and I think next weekend in the U.S. In the forest, that there's evergreen, kind of a Christmas tree type. That's a hemlock, with much shorter needle, tighter needle, and they are native as well. So hope that helps, Ron.
Yeah, hopefully that helps. Lots of information there. And if you have more specific questions, again, you can always write us at Down the Garden Path podcast at hotmail.com, and we'd be happy to answer either like a specific tree or a specific animal or shrub or anything like that. Just
Mhm.
before we get to our break, we jump into some design considerations. Matt has written in, hello down the garden path. What does herbaceous mean? So an excellent question, Matt. As I say herbaceous, I'm talking about plant material that is basically just fleshy leaves. So, for example, if you think of again like an echinacea, just a regular plant, it grows from the ground every year. It's leafy, fleshy stems. You might get a little bit of wood, but generally not. And then as the winter comes or the dormant season comes, it'll die back to the ground and leave nothing there. There are herbaceous annuals and the whole plant will die, or herbaceous perennials. So these are again like our echinaceas or the daisies, things like that. They will, or grasses, they'll die on top, but the roots will stay alive and they'll come back. So you can get, woody perennials, and those are trees and shrubs. They are not
Mhm.
herbaceous because they produce wood. They have vegetative parts to them that are somewhat like herbaceous, like soft tissues. But herbaceous generally means something that is completely without wood. So yeah, thank you very much for the question there, Matt. And as we hit the bottom of the hour, I'll just jump in and say thank you, everybody, for joining us here live on Reality Radio 101. I'm Matthew Dressing here with my co host and co author, Joanne Shaw, and you're listening to Down the Garden Path. Joanne and I enjoy hosting Down the Garden Path each week, bringing you interesting and relevant topics to help you achieve a great garden. We learn right along with you from our research and from the guests that join us here on the show. Don't forget, you can spend more time with us down the garden path. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Down the Garden Path Podcast is our handle there. You can also find us on your favorite podcast provider with lots of past episodes on nativars, native trees, and some of the other amazing topics we talk about through the whole year. While you're there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to be notified of new content. And don't forget to like, share, and leave us a comment. We love hearing from you, our listeners. Don't forget, you can always write us here down the Garden Path podcast at hotmail.com, or you can find us via our websites. You can find Joanne at down2earth.ca, and you can find myself at naturalaffinity.ca. So, designing with our
Mhm.
perennials, our
Mhm.
native perennials, trees, our native shrubs. So we've defined what our native plants are. We're going to see, whether they're right here with us or in a larger area. Maybe they're more North American native. But what do we do with them when it comes to designing with them in our garden? One of the most popular kind of easy way to get introduced into native plants is nativars. We talked about that last week on the show. But what is a nativar? So we're always in the plant world, we're always trying to improve upon or cherry pick those great characteristics of the plants that we love so much. Right. So every year there's a new hydrangea. Every year there's a new echinacea. Every year there's a new hosta. And it's all about colors or shape, growing conditions, disease resistance, et cetera, et cetera. So nativars are native plants that are cultivars of that native plant. So first of all, what is a cultivar? A,
Mhm.
a cultivar is basically any plant that we cultivate by man. So we're
Okay.
often, we've chosen, an echinacea grows at its does this, and it's yellow and white at the same time, and it grows. It's a nice dwarf, right? So we are cultivating that plant because that plant has occurred naturally. Cultivar basically means we're cultivating a variety, and we're keeping it in circulation by cultivating that plant. So nativars are native cultivars. So again, echinacea, rudbeckia, a lot of our perennial grasses, or a number of grasses. Again, depending on where you are, all of these names may or may not change. But basically, these nativars are cultivars of our native plants. So they're native, but they're native brothers and sisters to the original that's been here for the last 100,000 years or more or less. Mm-hmm. So nativars are a great way to go into the world of natives. Look at what native plants you're interested in that is in either your immediate area, your state, your province. Maybe again, you're looking for that ecoregion, and we'll put that ecoregion link in our show notes as well. So if you're looking for your ecoregion in North America, we can help you find it. But looking at that, for example, our echinacea is native to the plains. We have an echinacea native to Ontario in parts in northern New York State, but it's not the typical looking echinacea. It's Echinacea palmata, but it's a very narrow or fine leafed or fine petaled, drooping petaled echinacea, but it has that typical cone. So when you buy an echinacea, if you buy Echinacea purpurea, you're buying the native plant. If you buy Echinacea purpurea sombrero red, you're buying a cultivar or hybrid of that echinacea. So the nativars will often give you those, again, they'll attract those insects. They'll be that food source for bees, butterflies, birds, other insects. If you have a different species of red oak, it's still going to produce those acorns. Those insects will still come and investigate and use those acorns, but you're not using that species. And maybe, that cultivar is just a smaller red oak. So you can use it as a dwarf variety in an urban landscape. So that's what these nativars are. We're picking those, dwarf, disease resistance, color, conditions, resilience to use them in our urban landscape. So that is what our nativars are. So again, if you're looking into some native plants, a native plant, or your ecoregion, and you want to, that one looks really cool. I'd really like it. Sounds like it has a lot of benefits. I can't find it. Okay. But this is its name. What are the cultivars of that? And you can pick in and bring in some of those positive traits to the landscape in your ecoregion, but find a readily available plant.
That's right.
So that's what our nativars are.
Yeah. And sometimes, though, it is a negative. Like I think about the Echinacea sombrero. Like some of those have been, Echinacea is one plant that has been hybridized and cultivated a lot.
Like I said, every year there's a new echinacea.
There's a new one. Yeah. But they do say, one that you will find, if anybody's ever planted a red or orange or yellow echinacea, it's only, if it lasts 1 year, it might last 2. But then that usually it doesn't survive past that, right? They kind of peter out. They're not as strong. And there is some proof that they don't have the pollen or the nectar like their native parent. So sometimes it's the other opposite, right? In the sense that
watching how hybridized or how cultivated that group is, right? And echinacea is a great example of that pro and con, because again, we use it so much in absolutely everything, right? But if we think of like rudbeckia, I can think of Goldstrom star, which is a dwarf, and then the species.
Yes.
There's the 3 of them, really.
Yeah.
So,
Definitely.
So excellent point.
So for me, when I think about, there's a couple things if we want to talk about designing with them, and specifically perennials right now, because I think the perennial native plants do get a bit of a bad rap, and I'm guilty of it too, in that when I've taken some of the courses and then they go and show pictures and I'm like, yeah, I can't, it looks like a ditch. I can't put that. I can't design that for a client, So I think, you definitely with native plants do need to take a slightly different approach. I think if you are planting, 12 different kinds of plants, different colors and different in a one garden, I think that garden is going to look a little messy and weedy. So my first design tip would be to, and this tends to be overall as well, but less variety and bigger quantity. So pick two of your favorites and plant a swath of them. So now you're buying, so if you're going to do the purple on the echinacea, the palata that is native, you aren't going to buy one or two plants. You're going to buy five or six, and you're going to have like a nice big grouping. And then if you wanted to add an ornamental grass, looking at something like little blue stem, and again, you're
Hmm.
not going to plant two or three. You're going to get five or six or eight, and big, grouping of it. So then you've got a swath of, of the purple flowers, and you've got a swath of the little blue stem. It does have a blue tone to it. It has a burgundy kind of sheen also as it gets cooler in the fall. So it really is a cool grass. But just planting, and I've done that where I put one or two in, and it really doesn't look like much. So I think to be really happy with a native garden or native plants, from a design perspective, I think less is more. Less variety is more. Would you agree, Matt?
I agree. Uh, that was one of my points too, right? Less is more. Yeah. Instead of doing, the specimen of a one, or you always hear the rule of groups of three,
Yes.
or like
And
odd
I
numbers.
often do three, but sometimes it's not enough, right?
Right. But agreed. I agree with you. Yeah. When it comes to native, don't just do three. Do your five, your seven, and do them in a great big group. And again, less is more, right? You're gonna avoid picking all of your favorite native plants, mixing them all together, and creating that weird ditch meadow kind of look, right? So if you create those big vignettes of, here's a beautiful stand of little blue stem or big blue stem, or here's a beautiful swath of echinacea, right? You get that bang for it, and then you don't
Mhm.
get that wild look. I agree. Yeah. I was going to say with that as well is even creating some delineation, right? Creating little spaces within the garden. So don't let everything just kind of bleed together and get very English garden look. Maybe define some of those groups or the spaces between those groups with some decorative rocks, or an ornament. Or I think you had once mentioned to me from your course that you took, hedges make edges, right?
Right.
So creating kind of like a barrier or a line, or creating smaller rooms or departments or sections within the garden to kind of showcase off of those
Mhm.
groups. And it doesn't have to, even as I say, hedges make edges, from your course. You don't have to put in a hedge, but put in a smaller group of something else. Remember,
Mhm.
we're going to mix our ornamentals with our natives. So maybe you have some little blue stems, and then maybe you have a nice grouping of two or three dwarf hydrangeas. And then the echinacea comes over here, right? That echinacea or that group of hydrangeas can be the block or the
Mhm.
break between the two. Or maybe there's, it's a ground cover in front of something, right? In
Mhm.
front of that. But creating little pockets to create little breaks within in the landscape or within your planting. Yeah, instead of letting everything just kind of bleed together, because we all like full tight space, right? No soil kind of thing, or little or soil.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I think I agree. And I think you can do hedges too. I think hedges can really go a long way. And it doesn't have to be an evergreen hedge.
No.
It can be deciduous. It can be a perennial. Like I think of, well, right now the little girl across the street, my curb is all lined with catmint. And it's
Yeah.
not native. It is not native, but it's salt tolerant and it's drought tolerant, which is why it's in the spot, but the bees love it. So she's out standing on the street, like watching the bees and listening to the
Oh,
bees. And, she's a JK, and it's so cute to see. But, planting something like that, it's like I said, it's not native to us here. But it's got that silver foliage, and so even when it's not in flower, it still has a nice kind of silvery blue, gray foliage. It can make a nice hedge or nice edge, and then you could have other things that maybe sometimes they're not as pretty. Like milkweed isn't necessarily that. attractive, right?
Hmm.
And that's not the purpose. The purpose is to feed the butterflies, right? And the caterpillars. So, and you know me, I mean, I'm not a yellow fan, which I know our listeners will tease me about it, but even something like black-eyed Susans, you
Right.
can definitely do a row of that and then have other native plants like you can do big blue stem and some of the other larger plants or larger shrubs that are native. And I think it also goes for, and I've been guilty of this, is I've for years tried to put like one or two things in, like whether the client knows it or not, native plants. And serviceberry tends to be one easy one, right? Because it's
Hmm.
a great plant. It grows from full sun to full shade. You can get a tree, you can get it multi-stemmed. It has spring flower, berries for the birds, fall color. I mean, really, you can't beat it. But I've put one in the garden. Instead of doing a hedge or doing a whole back fence of, a grouping of three service berries to just make a statement and make a focal point, or doing three. And I know my girlfriend Nancy's done that, like beside the driveway, instead of just putting one at the front, she's done a grouping of three service berries. And so I think realizing that if it's especially in those ones that are tricky spots, like if you have challenging
Yeah.
soil, if you have a wet spot, if you have really hard, difficult clay soil, if you're not great at watering, if you go to the cottage all the time, then you want plants that are tougher. So that is, so it's okay to plant, not have to have, 12 different plants in your garden, right? You
Yeah.
can plant, three service berries and, things that will kind of, again, it gives you that seasonal interest, but you're still, have a beautiful, like it's still an eye, aesthetic.
Right. Yeah, you still have that ornamental value that we're, searching for, and we get
Right.
these non-natives for it in our garden. And like we're saying, you don't have to add 12 different ones, but you add the service berry and there's one of them. And maybe that's the only native plant in the whole garden, but you're drawing in and letting those around you know that there's something native here. And then
Hmm.
hopefully a little bit of everybody around you starts to add, natives here and there. So it's also as part of designing for natives. It's not, again, you don't have to convert your whole garden to natives to have an impact. Planting one or two species and incorporating them in an intelligent way. Again, growing for your soil or supporting something in your area that is, like monarchs were the big one. We all planted for monarchs because they suddenly disappeared.
Right.
Picking a specific reason, or like you said, our cottages up in the Muskokas, we've got shallow soil and it's rocky and it's dry. So we're planting for dry shade or even
Hmm.
dry sun with shallow roots. So we're picking plants for specific conditions.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and more, I do want everybody to do some research in your area. I mean, and I can't speak highly enough. Like I said, in Ontario, Canada, the David Suzuki Foundation, Butterfly Way, there's a whole, like the website and the information there on the native plants and the beneficial things. Also, I want to give a shout out, and everybody should Google, and we'll have it in our show notes, but Doug Tallamy. That's Tallamy. He's a prolific author. He's an what's I'm going to say, so it's etymologist, insects.
An entomologist, yeah.
Entomologist. I get etymologist and entomologist. So Google him. He has some wonderful, I've seen him speak. He spoke at the Landscape Designer Conference several years ago. He's written some great books about that whole chain of, the native plants and the importance. But I discovered many of his presentations, or he's let them be free on the internet, on YouTube.
Hmm.
So he's given some wonderful presentations and it'll be fascinating. You will be blown away. And he's also started something called Start a New Habitat Homegrown National Park. So all over the US and Canada, you kind of like register your backyard, your garden as part of a national. So he's saying if we can't claim land to create these national parks for these native plants, but if everybody's property can kind of all contribute and it's like a homegrown, right? We all take a little piece of it and we can create a homegrown national park. So it's an interesting a philosophy, and I'm on the site right now, and he has a lot of like places to resources for native plants. So Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center,
Hmm.
Audubon Native Plant Database, National Wildlife Federation, Native Plant Finder, Natural Garden Natives. So yeah, so there's many things, California Native Plant Society. So wherever you are listening to our show, we know that there's a community and resources right in your neck of the woods to learn more about how to plant them and where to plant them and where to get them. Because that is something, because of the popularity, all of a sudden, the seed collection and the actual
Yeah.
growing of them. We talked about them being at the garden centers when we both worked in garden centers, but it was always a small area. And
Yes.
so they often are harder to grow. So even if you go to a native plant nursery, you're getting like a tiny little thing in a pot, and it's $10, and you're like, what am I getting? So they do tend to take a little bit to get going. And again, like we said, don't necessarily look great right away. But if you once you start realizing and paying attention, I think when you go for that drive or you go to the cottage or you're in the country, and what those plants often, not always, but often are, you know, native.
Mm, exactly. Exactly.
And see how they're growing in that condition, right? When we're talking about designs, like see what
Yes.
you like. You know what I mean? Like maybe you do like that wilder meadow type look where things are mixed together and your grasses and your echinacea and your rutabaga are all growing in, maybe you like that, and that's okay. It's your yard, right? Um,
Exactly.
so yeah.
There's no right or wrong answer to designing
Hmm.
with natives. Really, you can go as
Hmm.
wild as you want, or you can get as manicured as you really would like as well. But
Hmm.
again, like you said, it's not going to be this perfect, fast-growing, beautiful, the stereotypical. I just bought this from the garden center look.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. And I do encourage people, especially the shade lovers or that,
Hmm.
typically, go thinking of hostas, like, well, we'll grow in the shade. Oh, well, hostas. There are some really great native plants for the shade.
Oh
And
yeah.
we spend a lot of time already talking about the, ones that for the sun, but things like wild ginger, things like May apple, it's a cool, funky leaf. Some of the native ferns are amazing,
Yeah. Native
and they kind of
ferns,
go with
sedges.
with Kathy Sedges, what Kathy talked about a couple weeks about the green mulch, right? Having
Hmm.
ground covers be green native plants that have those particular insects that do improve our soil, that are a little bit more, that are going to stand and not go dormant in the summer, like our non-native grass, like our lawn or turf grass, right? It's
Yes.
not native, so that's why it goes dormant in the heat of our summers.
Yeah, and it takes so many inputs just to keep it looking the way it does
Yes,
because it's
so
not where
much
it's
work.
from.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 One of my favorite is the white turtle head, the Cleone. Yeah,
Yes.
Cleone
Yeah.
glabra. I love that one in the part shade. Yeah, beautiful little turtles in the fall when you're not expecting it. Yeah,
Yeah. And trilliums. I mean, I think,
brilliant.
you don't want to go and dig them up, but you can buy them. And Canada anemone, it's another one that,
Yes, Canadian enemy.
it's a nice, it can be like, it can be a nice spreader. It's perfect under another example, underneath a spruce tree or a pine tree where nothing will grow. Many natives will grow perfectly fine. And often, so use when you're out for a walk and a hike, you can use Google Lens and kind of take, figure out what's growing an environment that's like yours or that you
Yes,
would like, and then take those names to a garden center and see if you can, or a website, and see if you can order the plants. So, Matt, they're not as easy to get from seed, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like many of the things we can start on our own and stuff, but that is more challenging, isn't it, with native plants?
yeah. Starting the seeds can be more challenging because they usually need that cold, moist stratification, and we're just used to grabbing seeds and planting them, and they do a
Hmm.
thing. When they need a little bit more of their natural winter treatment, to go over. Again, like you said, seed collecting too, right? Like now that there is such a demand for them, we haven't been collecting all of these seeds in this quantity to match everybody. So they can be, there's a scarcity issue for sure. I do like that, as you're saying about seeds, though. Remember picking seeds from your area as well. The seed that you have picked from that red oak or white oak that lives, within 100 miles is adapted to your condition. That seed will do better for you than the white or the red oak or whatever the seed that was bought, say, from the southern United States. Might have been collected there because they grow quicker, but that seed from the north is better than the seed from the south. So seeds can be sparse. They can be a little bit more to get going and get involved, starting them or leaving them outside over the winter and knowing where they are, getting them going in a pot, etc. Yeah. So yeah, seeds can be a thing, but usually we'll find them all in some sort of already started plant material. But it tends to be the smaller, 3.5 inch pot versus a 1 or 2 gallon tree or shrub or ornamental something.
Right. And we have done several past episodes about native plants, trees and shrubs and perennials, and nativars, trees and plants and shrub. So please go, to our podcast, and you can search for native and nativars. So if there's particular things that you want to learn more about or want to know what to purchase, then you can do that.
That's right. Just as we reach the end of our show, a couple of quick questions. Last was Olivia. Interesting information tonight. Perfect time. Can we plant these plants now? Most certainly, Olivia, as long as wherever you are, the soil is workable, the herbaceous, the softer stuff isn't going to get frozen. You are good to go. Gail wrote in as well. Hi, Joanne, and hi, Matt. Do you have to fertilize native plants or let them grow or feed naturally? Again, they're often adapted to our soils and what's naturally or natively there. They may need a little bit of help depending on your soil or what you've got going on in your conditions. But generally, they are okay to fend a little bit easier for themselves. Again, they'd like the lawn. They don't need all of that food input. But again, if you're not really using your native soil, they might need a little bit of a helping hand until they get really fully established, like everybody else. And then a normal top dressing of a compost or a manure is good to feed them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like you're really feeding the soil, and then they're relying on the soil. But they tend to not need as much as some of the non-hybrid, non-native
plants or ornamentals that are Japanese, whatever, or European something or other. Yeah. Not that they're not great plants. The world is filled with wonderful plants, no matter where you live.
Yeah. And some of them are real. Some are, we don't know, like, again, we've mentioned some of the really common ones. I think of prairie smoke.
I was going to say
everlasting. Like there's some really interesting ones, and they might be tinier and they might only bloom for a certain period of time. We'd mentioned milkweed for monarchs, but butterfly weed can be a little hard to get going. But it's, orange flowers and it's small. So there's some that are really, really interesting.
That's right. So we encourage you to take a look for your native plants. Write us here, Down the Garden Path, podcast@hotmail.com, if you have any other further questions. But thank you, everybody, for tuning in this evening. We look forward to talking to you next week at the same time with June in the Garden. It's our end of the month. What are we doing next month episode? So thank you, everybody, for tuning in here on Reality Radio 101. And we hope you'll join us next time here on Down the Garden Path.
Thank you for listening to Down the Garden Path with your host, Joanne Shaw and Matthew Dressing, right here on Reality Radio 101.